What if I told you there are two names so dangerous people who remember them begin to forget everything else? This is the chilling case of Cleres and Mapel twins, who didn't just make people disappear, they erased them from existence, and by the end of this story you might not remember them either. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far beyond the reach of paved roads and phone signals, there stood a house that seemed forgotten by time itself. It sat between towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving the land in a constant state of gray shadow. The locals had a name for it, the Silent Frame, because no matter the season, no matter the storm, the house never made a sound. No creaking wood, no rattling windows, not even the faint echo of wind passing through broken cracks. It was as if the house didn't breathe. People who lived miles away still avoided the narrow trail that led to it. Hunters would circle wide around that patch of forest. Even animals seemed to keep their distance. Birds would stop singing as they passed overhead, and sometimes they wouldn't pass at all. The story of the house began long before most of the town's current residents were born, but everything changed in the winter of 1987, the night the twins came into the world. It was a violent storm, the kind that shook the mountains and split trees in half. Snow fell thick and heavy, covering the ground in a matter of hours. Roads were blocked and no one could travel. That was the night Eliza Hale went into labor. There were no doctors, no midwives, only Jonah Hale. Neighbors later said they saw faint candle light flickering through the windows as thunder rolled across the sky. Some even claimed they heard something else, low, rhythmic chanting carried by the wind, but no one dared to go closer. By morning the storm had passed and Eliza Hale was dead. Jonah buried her behind the house without a funeral. No service, no prayers, no visitors, just a fresh patch of disturbed earth beneath a crooked oak tree. And inside the house, two newborns lay in silence, Cleres and Mapel. From the very beginning, something about them was different. Babies cry. It's the first thing they do. It's how they breathe, how they live. But these twins didn't cry. Not once. Jonah tried to feed them, hold them, comfort them, but they never made a sound. They would simply stare at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Hours would pass, and they wouldn't move. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night just to check if they were still alive. They always were, watching. As the months went by, the silence in the house grew heavier. Jonah stopped coming into town. At first, people assumed he was grieving. Then they thought he was ashamed. Eventually, they stopped thinking about him at all. Except for the rare moments when someone claimed to have seen the twins. At the age of 3, they were spotted standing at the edge of the forest near the main road. Barefoot still, side by side, a passing driver slowed down concerned. He rolled down his window to ask if they were lost. The twins turned their heads at the exact same moment, not slowly, not naturally, perfectly in sync. The man later said their eyes didn't look like children's eyes. They looked older, tired, as if they had seen things no one should ever see. Before he could speak again, the twins stepped backward into the trees and disappeared. When he reported the sighting, the sheriff paid a visit to Jonah Hale. The man insisted the children had never left the house. There was no proof to say otherwise. Still, the story spread. By the time the twins turned 6, they had become something of a local legend, though no one spoke of them openly. Parents warned their children not to wander too far into the woods, not because of wild animals, but because of them. Children talk, even when adults try to keep things quiet. At school, whispers began to form. One boy claimed he saw the twins standing outside his bedroom window late at night, even though his house was miles away from theirs. Another said he heard soft voices calling his name from the forest, voices that sounded exactly alike. But the strangest story came from a girl named Marcy Ellen. She said she saw the twins during a rainy afternoon while walking home. They were standing in the middle of the path, blocking her way. She tried to walk around them, but as she passed, one of them spoke. "You dropped something," the twins said. Marcy looked down, confused. There was nothing there. When she looked back up, both twins were staring directly at her. "You just don't remember yet," the other added. Marcy ran all the way home. That night, she forgot the name of her own pet dog, something she had never forgotten before. Her parents brushed it off as fear, but Marcy never walked that path again. Back at the silent frame, life inside the house remained hidden from the world. No lights at night, except for the occasional flicker of candles, no sounds during the day, only silence. And watching, as the twins grew older, their behavior became even more unsettling. They didn't play like normal children. They didn't laugh or argue or explore. Instead, they spent hours sitting across from each other, unmoving, as if locked in a conversation no one else could hear. Sometimes Jonah would hear them whispering late at night. When he tried to listen, the voices would stop immediately. Other times he would enter a room and find them standing inches apart, staring into each other's eyes without blinking. It was as though they shared something deeper than language, something unnatural. Jonah himself began to change. He grew thinner, paler, his eyes sank deep into his face. The few people who saw him in those years said he looked like a man slowly fading away. Once a traveling preacher knocked on his door, offering prayers and comfort. Jonah didn't invite him inside. Instead, he stepped out, closing the door tightly behind him. The preacher later recalled something strange. As Jonah spoke, there were faint shapes moving behind the curtains, two figures standing still, watching. Before leaving, the preacher placed a hand on Jonah's shoulder and said, "Whatever is in that house, you need to let it go." Jonah's expression didn't change. "They won't let me," he replied quietly. After that, the preacher never returned. Years passed, and the house remained as it always had, silent, still, untouched. But something was building. The forest around the house seemed darker, the air heavier. Even the townspeople who tried to ignore it began to feel an unease they couldn't explain. Because deep in the mountains, inside a house that didn't breathe, the two children were growing, watching, learning, and waiting. By the summer of 1998, the unease that had quietly settled over the town began to take shape. It started with something small, a missing girl. Her name was Leila Monroe, a bright and talkative 11-year-old who lived with her parents just outside the town's center. She was known for her laugh, loud, careless, and impossible to ignore. The kind of laugh that made people turn their heads and smile without knowing why. On the day she disappeared, nothing seemed unusual. School ended early because of the heat. Children poured out into the dusty yard, eager to escape into the long afternoon. Leila stayed back for a few minutes, chatting with a friend near the gate. She mentioned she'd be taking the forest path home, the shortcut she'd used dozens of times before. "Race you tomorrow," she joked, waving as she left. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Leila didn't return home by evening, her parents weren't immediately worried. It wasn't uncommon for children to lose track of time, especially during summer. But as the sun dipped behind the mountains and darkness crept in, concern turned into fear. By nightfall, the town had begun searching. Flashlights cut through the trees as volunteers called out her name. The sheriff organized search parties, mapping out the forest in sections. Dogs were brought in, sniffing along the narrow dirt path Leila was known to take. At first, the dogs followed her scent easily. Then, suddenly, they stopped, right in the middle of the trail. Handlers tried to push them forward, but the dogs refused. They whined, pulled back, and in some cases began to bark at nothing, staring into the deeper woods, as if something unseen was watching them. It was the first sign that something wasn't right. The search continued for days. No footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle, just silence. Then, on the fifth day, a hunter made a discovery. He was walking deeper into the forest than most dared to go, following a deer trail that curved away from the main path. That's when he saw it, a single shoe, small, blue, slightly worn. It was placed neatly at the base of a tree. Not tossed, not dropped, placed. The hunter immediately recognized it from the missing posters plastered around town. It belonged to Leila. When the sheriff arrived, he examined the scene carefully. There were no drag marks, no blood, no broken branches, nothing to suggest violence. It looked almost intentional, as if someone had left it there to be found. That's when the whispers began. People didn't say it out loud at first. They spoke in quiet voices, behind closed doors, careful not to be heard. But the name was always the same, the Hale twins, Cleres and Mapel. The sheriff, a practical man named Daniel Rourke, didn't believe in rumors. He had spent years dealing with real problems: drunken fights, stolen livestock, the occasional runaway teen. But this case felt different, too clean, too empty. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing tension in the town. And so, against his better judgment, he decided to visit the Hale house. The road leading there was barely visible now, overgrown with weeds and shadowed by towering trees. As he approached, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. The house stood exactly as described, still. Silent, watching, Rourke knocked on the door. For a long moment there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Jonah Hale stood in the doorway, thinner than expected, his face pale and hollow. His eyes looked tired, too tired for a man his age. "Sheriff," Jonah said quietly, as if he had been expecting him. Rourke explained the situation, asking if Jonah had seen or heard anything unusual in recent days. Jonah listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "They've been here," Jonah replied after a pause. "Who?" the sheriff asked. "The children," Jonah said. "They don't leave." Something in his tone felt rehearsed. Rourke glanced past him into the dark interior of the house. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. Jonah hesitated. Just for a second, then he stepped aside. The inside of the house felt wrong the moment Rourke entered. The air was stale, thick with something he couldn't quite place. The rooms were dim, lit only by weak strands of light slipping through dusty windows. And then he saw them, Cleres and Mapel. They stood at the far end of the hallway, side by side, perfectly still. They didn't greet him, didn't move, didn't even blink. They just stared. Rourke had seen frightened children before, kids caught in bad situations, kids who didn't trust strangers. But this wasn't fear. This was something else, something empty. "How old are they now?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. 11, Jonah answered. The sheriff studied them carefully. They didn't look 11. There was something older in their posture, in their gaze. Something that didn't belong in children. "Did either of you go into the woods this week?" Rourke asked, addressing them directly. For a moment there was no response. Then one of the twins tilted her head slightly. "We go where we're needed," she said softly. The other twins spoke immediately after. "And we stay where we're kept." Their voices were calm, identical, almost echoing each other. Rourke felt a chill run down his spine. "That's not an answer," he said. Both twins smiled. It was small, subtle, but wrong. "We didn't take her," one said. "She came to us." The other added. Jonah stepped forward quickly. "That's enough," he snapped, his voice shaking. The twins fell silent again. Rourke decided not to push further. There was no evidence, nothing he could use, just strange words and a growing sense of unease. As he turned to leave, he felt their eyes following him, every step of the way. At the door, he paused. "Jonah," he said, "if you remember anything at all, you need to come to me." Jonah nodded, but his expression didn't change. Rourke stepped outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air. It felt like escaping something he couldn't explain. He had almost reached his car when he heard it, a whisper, soft, close. "Not all things that are lost want to be found." He turned quickly. The twins were standing in the doorway now, closer than before. He couldn't tell which one had spoken. Maybe both. Rourke drove away faster than he intended. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them standing in that dark hallway, staring without blinking. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought began to grow. What if Leila Monroe hadn't been taken? What if she had gone willingly? Days turned into weeks, the search slowed, then stopped. Leila Monroe was declared missing. But in the quiet corners of the town, people began to feel something shifting, not grief, not closure. Something else, something colder. Because deep in the forest, beyond the path where the dogs refused to go, something had changed. And whatever had taken Leila Monroe wasn't finished yet. Time has a way of softening fear. At least that's what people in the town believed. After Leila Monroe disappeared, life slowly returned to something that looked normal. Children went back to school. Shops reopened. The forest path once avoided was cautiously used again. People stopped speaking her name as often, not because they didn't care, but because there was nothing left to say. No answers, no body, no ending, but the silence never truly left. It lingered in the background like a low hum no one could quite hear, but everyone could feel. And then, 5 years later, everything came back, stronger, darker. In October of 2003, a call came into the sheriff's office just after sunrise. It was from a postal worker who hadn't seen Jonah Hale in weeks. Concerned about the growing pile of undelivered mail, he had decided to walk up to the house himself. What he found made him turn back immediately and call for help. Sheriff Daniel Rourke arrived within the hour. The road to the Hale house looked worse than before, more overgrown, more forgotten. The trees seemed thicker, closing in as if they were trying to hide something. When Rourke stepped onto the porch, the first thing he noticed was the door. It was slightly open, not broken. Not forced, just open. He pushed it slowly and stepped inside. The silence hit him immediately. It was the same silence he remembered from years ago, but heavier now. Pressing, suffocating, "Jonah," he called out. No response. He moved through the house carefully, each step echoing faintly against the wooden floor. Dust coated everything. It didn't look like anyone had cleaned or moved anything in a long time. Then he saw him. Jonah Hale was sitting in a chair in the living room, upright, still. His hands rested on his knees and his eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. At the basement door, Rourke approached slowly, his instincts already telling him something was wrong. "Jonah," he said again. No movement, no breath. He was dead. The medical examiner would later confirm it as heart failure. No signs of struggle, no injuries, nothing unusual, at least not on paper. But Rourke knew better. People didn't die like that. Not sitting upright, staring at a door as if they had seen something they couldn't escape. And then there were the twins. They were gone, no signs of them anywhere in the house. No clothes missing, no footprints leading away. It was as if they had simply vanished. For the first time, the Hale house was no longer off limits. Rourke called in a full investigation team. Every room was searched, every drawer opened, every inch examined. At first, they found nothing out of the ordinary, just the remains of a life slowly falling apart. Old furniture, faded photographs, dust. But then one of the deputies noticed something strange about the basement door. It wasn't locked, but it felt sealed, like it hadn't been opened in years. It took effort to pull it open. The wood scraped against the frame with a deep, groaning sound that echoed through the house. And beneath it, darkness. Thick, heavy, waiting. Rourke led the way down. The stairs creaked under his weight, each step taking him deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder as he descended, carrying a faint, unpleasant smell he couldn't identify. When his flashlight reached the bottom, he froze. The basement wasn't empty, it was filled. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old videotapes, dozens of them. Maybe more. Some were neatly arranged. Others were piled carelessly, as if they had been handled often. Each tape had a label, dates and names. Rourke stepped closer, picking one up. June 12, 1996, Aaron P. Another. March 3, 1998, Leela M. His stomach tightened. "Get evidence bags," he said quickly. "We're taking all of this." The team worked in silence, carefully collecting the tapes. No one spoke about what they might find, but everyone felt it. Something was very wrong. Back at the station, they set up a viewing room. Rourke insisted on watching the tapes himself. The first one they played was dated 1995. The screen flickered to life. A child sat in a chair, a boy no older than 10. His hands rested in his lap, not tied, not restrained. He wasn't crying. He wasn't struggling. He was just sitting, staring at the camera. "Can you tell us your name?" A voice asked softly from behind the camera. The boy hesitated. "I don't remember," he said. Rourke frowned. "What do you mean?" the voice asked again. The boy's expression shifted slightly, confusion, fear. I knew it before, he whispered. I just can't think of it now. There was a pause. Then another voice joined in. We can help you remember. Rourke felt his chest tighten. The voices were identical. Calm, soft, Cleres and Mapel. The camera shifted slightly, but the twins never appeared on screen. Only their voices filled the room, circling the boy like something unseen. Close your eyes, one said. Think about your home, the other added. The boy obeyed. Seconds passed. Then minutes. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed. He looked empty. Do you remember now? They asked. The boy shook his head slowly. No, he said, and then the screen went black. Rourke stared at the monitor, his mind racing. Play the next one, he said. Tape after tape revealed the same pattern, different children, different dates. But always the same setup, the same voices, and the same outcome, confusion, fear, then nothing. But it was the tape labeled Leela M. that shook him the most. She looked exactly as described in the missing reports, same hair, same bright eyes. At first, Leela, one of the twins, said gently, tell us about your family. Leela smiled nervously. My mom makes the best pancakes, she said. And my dad, she stopped. Her smile faded. What's his name? The other twin asked. Leela blinked. I don't know, she whispered. Rourke felt a cold wave wash over him. That's okay. The voices reassured her. You don't need it anymore. The recording continued for several more minutes. By the end, Leela wasn't smiling. She wasn't speaking. She was just sitting there, silent, empty, gone. Rourke leaned back, his hands trembling slightly. This isn't kidnapping, one of the deputies said quietly. No, Rourke replied, it's something else. But the most disturbing discovery came from the later tapes. On recordings dated years earlier, the twins sounded like children's soft, high-pitched voices. But as the tapes progressed, their voices changed. Deeper, older, and in some videos, their reflections briefly appeared in the background. They weren't children anymore. They looked grown. The timeline didn't make sense. It was impossible. Unless Rourke didn't finish the thought. He didn't want to, because if it was true, it meant something far worse than anything he had imagined. The twins weren't just taking memories. They were changing, evolving, becoming something beyond human. Rourke turned off the monitor, the room falling into silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he said the only thing that mattered now. Find them, but deep down he already knew the truth. They hadn't disappeared. They had simply moved on. And whatever they had become was still out there. By the time investigators reached the final tape, the room felt different. No one spoke anymore. The earlier disbelief had faded into something heavier, something closer to dread. The officers who had once leaned forward with curiosity now sat back in their chairs, tense and quiet, as if bracing for something they didn't want to see. Sheriff Daniel Rourke stood near the monitor, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen. He had seen enough to know that whatever was coming next would not be simple. These were no longer just recordings, they were messages. The tape had no name, no date, just a black label. That alone made it different from all the others. Go ahead, Rourke said quietly. The technician pressed play. For a moment, nothing appeared. The screen flickered with static, a low humming sound filling the room. Then, slowly, the image came into focus, the basement, but it didn't look exactly the same. The walls seemed darker, almost damp, as if something had seeped into them over time. The air looked thick, heavy, like a fog that refused to move. The single light above flickered softly, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor. And then they stepped into frame, Cleres and Mapel, but they were not children anymore. They stood taller now, their bodies thin but steady, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces had matured, but not naturally. There was something off about the way their features had settled, as if they had grown into their forms too quickly, skipping something essential along the way. Their eyes were the same, wide, unblinking, empty. For the first time in any of the recordings, they stood directly in front of the camera. Facing it, watching, and then together they spoke. We were not born. The words were clear, calm, perfectly in sync. We were invited. A faint chill ran through the room. Rourke felt it in his chest. A tightening, like something pressing inward. The twins tilted their heads slightly, almost like they were listening to something far away. You've been watching, one of them said. And now you want to understand, the other continued. Their voices were no longer childlike. They carried a strange weight now, older, steadier, layered with something that didn't belong to either age or time. The camera shifted slightly, as if it had been adjusted before recording. For a brief moment, something appeared in the background. A shape low, unclear, gone as quickly as it came. Our mother opened the door. One twin said softly. She didn't know what would come through. The other added. The words hung in the air. Rourke's mind raced. Eliza hailed the storm, the whispers people claimed to hear that night. She believed it was a blessing. One of the twins continued. A gift, the other said. Their expressions didn't change, but gifts can be taken back. They said together. The light above them flickered again, casting shadows that moved in unnatural directions. For a brief second, their silhouettes stretched along the wall behind them. Too long, too distorted, like reflections of something much larger than their bodies. Then everything returned to normal. We needed to grow, one twin said, and to grow we needed to feed. Rourke felt his jaw tighten. Feed, not food, not survival, something else. We do not take flesh, they continued. We take what makes you you. The room remained silent, but the meaning was clear. Memories, identity, existence itself, that is why they are not found. One said, that is why they are not remembered. The other followed. Rourke's thoughts turned immediately to the tapes, the missing names, the erased records, Leela Monroe. Had she ever truly existed anymore? They come to us, the twins said. They are drawn. The camera flickered again. And this time a faint sound could be heard beneath their voices. A low hum, not mechanical, not natural. Something deeper, something old. Our father tried to stop us. Rourke's focus snapped back. The twins' expressions shifted slightly. Not emotion, not quite, but something close to acknowledgement. He locked the door. He buried the truth, but he forgot something. They leaned closer to the camera. He was already empty. The screen cut for a split second, then resumed. The basement looked the same, but now there was another figure in the frame. Jonah Hale. He stood near the stairs, his posture tense, his face pale with fear. His eyes darted between the twins, as if searching for something familiar, something human. But he didn't find it. What are you? He asked, his voice shaking. The twins turned toward him slowly. At the exact same time, you know what we are, one said. You just don't remember. The other added. Jonah stepped back, his breathing uneven. This isn't real, he whispered, but even as he said it, his expression changed. Confusion, fear, doubt, as if something inside him was slipping away. You've been with us for years, they continued. You've seen everything. Jonah shook his head. No, I would remember. The twins smiled, that same small, wrong smile. Would you? They asked together. The room watching the tape felt colder. Rourke's hands slowly clenched into fists. He understood now. Jonah hadn't just been hiding them, he had been losing himself, piece by piece, day by day. Until there was nothing left, the video continued. Jonah's movements slowed. His expression became distant, unfocused. What was I doing? He murmured. He looked around the basement as if seeing it for the first time. The tapes, the walls, the darkness, I don't remember any of this, he said. The twins stepped closer. You don't need to, they replied. Jonah's body went still, his eyes widened slightly, and then he stopped moving. The moment stretched out in silence. The twins turned back to the camera. Now you understand, they said. The humming sound grew louder for a brief second, then faded. You cannot stop us. You cannot find us, because to find us, they leaned in closer, their faces filling the screen. You must remember us. The light flickered violently, the image distorted, and just before the screen went black, their eyes changed. For a fraction of a second, not empty, not human, something deeper, something endless, then darkness. The tape ended. The room remained silent long after the screen went black. No one moved, no one spoke. Rourke stared at the empty monitor, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. This wasn't just a crime. It wasn't even something he could explain. It was something older, something that didn't follow rules, didn't leave evidence, didn't need to, because it erased everything behind it. Slowly he turned to the others. "We're not looking for people," he said quietly. "We're looking for something that doesn't want to exist." No one argued. Because deep down, they all understood the truth. The twins weren't hiding. They weren't running. They were spreading. And the worst part, the more they succeeded, the less anyone would remember they were ever there at all. After the final tape ended, the investigation didn't stop. If anything, it became more urgent. Sheriff Daniel Rourke pushed harder than ever before. What he had seen couldn't be ignored, not as a story, not as a rumor, not as something to be buried and forgotten. There were too many pieces, too many missing people, too many unanswered questions, but the deeper they looked, the less they found. It began with the names. The tapes had dozens of them, children mostly. Each label carried a date and a name, written carefully, almost respectfully. At first, the team worked through them methodically, cross-checking records, searching databases, contacting nearby towns. But something didn't add up. Some of the names led nowhere, no birth certificates, no school records. No medical history, nothing. It was as if those people had never existed. At first, they assumed clerical errors. Maybe fake names, maybe children from outside the region. But as the days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Even the names they did recognize began to fade. Files went missing, reports became incomplete, photographs once clear started to blur at the edges. One of the deputies, a man named Carter, was the first to notice. He had been reviewing the Leela Monroe case file late one evening. He knew it well, everyone in town did. He had seen her missing poster countless times. Her face had once been impossible to forget. But now something was wrong. He stared at the photograph clipped to the report. It looked faded, not old, just unclear. As if someone had smudged it without touching it. Carter leaned closer, squinting. What color were her eyes? He muttered to himself. He tried to remember. He couldn't. A strange unease settled over him. He flipped through the rest of the file, scanning the notes, the witness statements. Everything was still there, but it felt distant, unfamiliar, like reading about a stranger. The next morning he brought it to Rourke. "Something's happening to the files," Carter said, placing the folder on the desk. Rourke opened it, his expression tightening as he looked through the pages. He had seen this file 100 times, but now it didn't feel the same. "She used to have a bracelet," Rourke said slowly. "A red one. Her mother mentioned it in the report." Carter nodded. "It's not there anymore." They searched the file again. The detail was gone, not crossed out, not removed, just gone. That was the moment Rourke realized the truth wasn't contained in the tapes. It was still happening. They expanded the investigation, pulling every record connected to the Hale case. Old reports, missing persons files, school attendance logs, anything that might help rebuild what had been lost. But the more they gathered, the more unstable it all became. Dates didn't match. Names disappeared between pages. Entire documents seemed to lose meaning the longer they were studied. Even digital records weren't safe. Files became corrupted without explanation. Text distorted. Images failed to load. It was as if something was actively resisting being remembered. And then the tapes began to change. At first it was subtle, a flicker here, a distortion there. Faces became harder to make out. Voices grew faint, as if they were being pulled away from the recordings. Rourke ordered copies to be made immediately. It didn't help. The copies degraded just as quickly. Within days, entire sections of footage were lost. Children who had once appeared clearly on screen were now nothing more than blurred shapes. Their voices reduced to static. Only one thing remained consistent: the twins, Cleres and Mapel. No matter how damaged the tapes became, they were always clear. Always visible, always watching. It didn't take long for fear to spread among the team. Some refused to continue working the case. Others requested transfers. A few simply stopped showing up altogether. Carter lasted the longest, but even he began to change. He grew quieter, more distracted. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, his expression blank, as if he had forgotten what he was saying. One afternoon, Rourke found him staring at a wall in the records room. "Carter," he called, no response. He stepped closer. "Carter." The deputy blinked, turning slowly. For a moment, his eyes looked empty. Then he shook his head, as if waking from a dream. "Sorry," he said. I just lost track of something. Rourke studied him carefully. What were you doing? Carter hesitated. I don't remember. The words hung in the air. That night, Rourke went home and locked his doors. He sat at his kitchen table with a notebook in front of him, writing everything he could remember about the case. Every detail, every name, every moment. He didn't trust the files anymore. He didn't trust his own memory. So he wrote, page after page, filling the notebook with everything he knew. When he finished, he placed it beside his bed. Just in case, days passed, then weeks, and slowly the case began to disappear. Not officially, not publicly, but quietly the urgency faded, the reports slowed, conversations shifted to other matters, new cases took priority. It wasn't that people didn't care, it was that they couldn't hold on to it. The details slipped away too easily. The fear dulled, the memories blurred. Even Rourke felt it happening. He would wake in the morning and struggle to recall certain parts of the investigation. Small things at first, then larger ones. One day, he opened his notebook and didn't recognize his own handwriting. Another day, he read a name, Leela Monroe, and felt nothing, no connection, no memory, just a name on a page. That's when he understood. This wasn't something that could be solved. It wasn't something that could be stopped. Because it didn't exist in a way that allowed it to be fought. It erased itself and everything around it. Eventually, the Hale house was sealed, not because the case was closed, but because there was nothing left to investigate. The tapes were locked away, what remained of them. Rourke retired not long after. He never spoke publicly about the case again. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone and stare at the woods beyond his home, and he would feel it. That same quiet unease, that same sense of being watched. Years later, travelers passing through the Appalachian roads began to report strange sightings. Two figures standing side by side in the trees, always at a distance, always still. At first, people dismissed it as imagination. Shadows, tricks of the light, but the stories were consistent, too consistent. Some said the figures looked like children. Others claimed they appeared older, but everyone agreed on one thing: they were always together, and they were always watching. A few who claimed to have seen them up close described something even more unsettling. A feeling, not fear. Not exactly, something quieter, as if something inside them had shifted. One man reported forgetting where he was going after seeing the figures. Another said he couldn't remember the face of his own brother for several hours. The effects were temporary. Most of the time, but not always. And then there were the ones who couldn't remember seeing anything at all. Only that something felt missing. No one could prove these stories, no evidence, no photographs, no recordings. Just fragments, just feelings, just absence, and somewhere, deep in the Appalachian wilderness, beyond the roads and the trails and the reach of memory, they remain. Cleres and Mapel, not hiding, not running, but existing in a space where memory cannot hold them, growing, feeding, waiting, because as long as they are forgotten, they are free. And the most terrifying part, you may have already heard their names before. You may have already seen them standing just beyond your focus, watching quietly, waiting patiently. But if you try to remember, if you really try to hold on to who they are, you might feel it. That small, slipping sensation, like a thought fading too quickly, like a name just out of reach, and then nothing. Because Cleres and Mapel were never meant to stay in your mind, only to pass through it and take something with them when they leave.